right. Well, my son gave me a few notes before I came up, so this is good. I have a question for you. Have you guys ever been in a crowd that was so big you couldn't move? Like so big it made you nervous? You know what I'm talking about? I have a couple of those crowd experiences. Once, it was when I was a lot older. I was at my first University of Tennessee football game, and the University of Tennessee was vying with Michigan to see who could have the most seats in a football stadium. I was one of 107,000 fans in a football game. It was pretty awesome, except I found out if you're one of 107,000 fans, they really only sold you half a seat. So you get one half for you, and then the other half's on your buddy's lap. But the one crowd I will always remember, in fact, it's the crowd that my dad still talks about today, is when I was in middle school. And in middle school, it was Thanksgiving, and my mom always wanted to go into downtown Kansas City, the plaza, and to see them do the lights. See, the plaza was this beautiful, shopping and restaurant area. It kind of looked like Madrid, because Kansas City's sister city is Madrid, so little fact you didn't know there. And they had fountains everywhere, but every Christmas, they would, string the entire place with lights. And they would do a big lighting on Thanksgiving. And my mom's like, oh, we have to go. So my brother, my dad, myself, and my mom, we all pile in the car, and we get there. We get there really early, and there's already a big crowd. So we find that spot, kind of midway, right in front of the stage, and we're like, okay, it's getting a little crowd. It just kept going, and the crowd kept growing. Finally, the crowd was so big, you were literally, standing like this, and if you wanted to move, the only way you were going to move is if the crowd moved. To this day, that is the one time my dad says he's felt uncomfortable in a crowd, and that is the only time we saw them do the lights. It was beautiful, seen it once, not going back. Because crowds like that, they're hard to maneuver in. There's people all around you, and it's kind of one of those situations where everybody is touching you, right? That's what happens in a massive crowd. Well, what made me think about that was in today's story, Jesus is in the midst of a crowd. And it was a crowd a lot like you saw at the plaza, where it started big, and it just kept growing. And it's in the midst of this crowd that Luke shares an incredible story for those who feel like they go unnoticed. And the story goes like this. Luke says that Jesus had just returned, and the crowd welcomed him. So they were literally there waiting for him when he got back. And it says, and there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue, and falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had a daughter, his only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. So here Luke tells the story about this crowd that had gathered waiting for Jesus, and then in the midst of the crowd, this very important person in the town, the ruler of the synagogue, comes, and he just falls down at Jesus' feet, begging him for his help. So what Luke describes right there is somebody who is desperate and important. And a lot of times when we see people that are desperate and important, it feels pretty obvious to us that people are going to come to their aid. And this is just such a person. So as Luke is telling this story, it's no surprise to us that Jesus goes to help Jairus. And in fact, people start hearing that this is happening, so the crowd starts growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And in fact, it starts to grow so big that in the gospel here, Luke describes it like this. He says, the people pressed around him. And I thought that was kind of an interesting term to use for a crowd. People just pressing around you. And so I looked it up. And in the original Greek, Luke is literally describing a crowd that is so big, it's like it's choking you. Can you imagine that many people? It'd be like if we got everybody here and we just all stood up in this little area right here. That would be what's going on. And in this crowd, Jesus starts walking. And so you imagine the entire crowd has to start kind of walking with him as they're all now going to Jairus' house so Jesus can save his daughter. And Luke tells us in the midst of the crowd, there's another person. He says, there's a woman. And I love that he says it's a woman. Because he doesn't tell you her name. He's like, this person I'm about to talk about is so insignificant. I can't even remember what her name was. But there was this woman in the crowd. And it said that this woman had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she'd spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. And so what Luke starts to tell you is in the midst of this moment where Jesus is meeting with somebody who's desperate and important, another person comes in, somebody who's desperate and insignificant. And I imagine being this woman. Imagine what it's like to have a disease that you can't cure for 12 years. You have spent every penny you have to try to cure, and nothing's working. And you may say to yourself, why is this such a big deal? Because this particular disease the woman has is actually described in the book of Leviticus. And in this disease, it says this in the book of Leviticus, chapter 15, if a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of her discharge, she shall continue in her uncleanness, as in the days of her impurity. Now you may be saying, okay, what in the world does that mean? Have you ever had that, like, is that in your daily devotion, right? Hey, pastor, I was just going through Leviticus, and this chapter popped up. See, what you have to understand about this is in that culture, there were three categories. There was holy. Holy is what God is always described as. Set apart, pure, perfect. The things that you would find in the temple were consecrated so that they would be holy, so they could be in the presence of God. There were parts of the temple that nobody could ever walk in because that's where the presence of God would dwell. That's where what you called the Holy of Holies. So there was the holy things, the things of God. And then there were the things that were just clean or common. And that just meant these were things that were pretty much normal. They could approach the presence of God, but they couldn't touch it. And then there were the things that were unclean. The things that had something so wrong with them, they couldn't even approach the steps of the temple. They couldn't come into worship. And the thing about things that were unclean is that in the Levitical structure, in the way the society was ordered, the unclean things always had to be separated. They always had to be set away from the community. Because the problem with somebody that was unclean is if they came in contact with somebody that was clean, all of a sudden that person would be unclean. And that meant a couple things. Number one, you were separated from your community. So you couldn't be in a place where you could engage with other people because you might make them unclean. And if you made them unclean, then those people wouldn't be able to go to the temple. They wouldn't be able to worship God. And so here you have this woman for the last 12 years who has been considered unclean or completely disconnected from her community and what's even worse, from God. And she has spent every penny she has to try to change that. But nothing seems to work. And so now she hopes that if she can just come and connect with Jesus, all that can change. And I'm sure in her mind, as she was thinking about this scenario, she was hoping, well, maybe I'll catch Jesus right as he's coming off the boat, and nobody else will be there, or maybe just his disciples, and I could come up and I could explain my story to him, and then all of a sudden Jesus would know what was going on, and he'd want to heal me. I'm sure that's what she expected. Or maybe she expected there'd be a little bit of a crowd, but at least she'd be able to kind of like work her way over to Jesus and stop him for a second because he'd just be kind of on his way to lunch. And she could say, hey, let me tell you about my life. Could you please help me? But when she shows up, there's a massive crowd there. A crowd so big you can barely move. A crowd so big it's like you're being choked by the people around you. And she knows she's barely going to have a chance to stand near Jesus, let alone talk to him. And then something happens. Something unexpected. Somehow she's able to work her way close enough in that crowd to where she can actually reach out and touch Jesus. But she knows she shouldn't do that. Because if she does that, she would make Jesus unclean. And then Jesus couldn't go to the temple. And maybe that's where Jesus was going because he was hanging out with the ruler of the synagogue. She should never reach out and touch him. Not to mention, he's a holy rabbi. And yet she's so desperate for healing. Luke tells us that in this crowd, she just reaches out and she touches Jesus. Because she says, look, I may not be able to talk to him. I may not be able to sit down and have a conversation and explain to him everything that's going on. But if I can just reach out and touch him, I think I can find what I'm looking for. I think I can find healing. And in that moment, she does it. I imagine the faith and the courage it took her to even reach out and just try to grab a hold of Jesus. But she does it. She reaches out and she touches him, thinking the crowd will just keep moving. And Luke tells us this. It's amazing. It says, immediately her discharge of blood ceased. She was healed just by touching him. But then something else happens. Jesus stops. He just stops right there in that moment, stops the entire crowd, stops going on his way to Jairus' house, and he just stops and he sits there and he says this. He says, who is it that touched me? And everybody's kind of looking around going, Jesus, do you see the crowd? The question is not who touched you, the question is who did not touch you. And Peter's looking at him and he says to Jesus, Jesus, look, the crowd's surrounding you. They're pressing in on you. But Jesus says, someone touched me. For I perceived that power has gone out from me. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down declared to him in the presence of all people why she had touched him and how she'd been immediately healed. I kind of wondered, why was she so afraid in that moment? I mean, Jesus had just healed her, right? She's trembling and she's falling down there, and you can imagine she's stumbling over the story as she tries to tell everybody what happens. And you ask yourself the question, why was she was healed? Shouldn't she be excited? Shouldn't she be happy? Maybe she was afraid. Maybe she was afraid that Jesus, like everybody else, would realize who reached out and touched her. Maybe she was afraid that if Jesus realized it was this unclean woman that had reached out and grabbed a hold of him, that he would take it back. Maybe she was thinking of the stories in the Old Testament about the times that unclean people, or even just the wrong people, got too close to the sacred things of God, and God killed them on the spot because of his holiness. She sits there and she says, I don't know anybody more holy than Jesus. So why wouldn't he do the same to me? A woman who till this day couldn't even find healing. And Jesus is looking at her, and I'm sure all the scenarios are going through her head. And all he does when he sees her laying there and he hears her story is he says this, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. I love what he does there, because you got to understand, Jesus, he's with the desperate and important person, and he's on his way to do this important thing for this important person, and this insignificant, desperate woman, a woman who we don't even know her name, comes up. And Jesus stops everything. Not to heal her, she's already healed, but to look her in the eyes and to tell someone who thinks they have no significance, you are significant. To tell someone who thinks they are unredeemable, you have been redeemed. Jesus stops to tell her that. This is what's so powerful about Jesus. See, this woman, she was in this category of unredeemable. And I think a lot of times we have those categories of unredeemable. And in fact, you can be told so much in your life that you're unredeemable that you start to believe it. And you're afraid to even approach Jesus. But Jesus says, no, there is no unredeemable. Jesus is the Redeemer that actually redeems the unredeemable. I love it because I was reading in Hebrews last week. And it's a verse that's stuck with me. I can't get it out of my head. I share it with like everybody I know. It's Hebrews chapter 4. And in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 16, it says this: "Since then we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace and help in our time of need." What I love is Jesus is looking there, and in a world where there's holy and clean and unclean, and in a world where there's the redeemable and the unredeemable, Jesus looks out and he says, do not be afraid to approach me. Because in my economy, in my world, even the unredeemable becomes redeemable. I love that story of the woman, because that story of the woman reminds me of another woman I knew. A woman that used to come out to my church named Cricket. And Cricket, she was the coolest person ever. She would always come to the early service. She would come in and she would sneak out, and after a while she started sticking around a lot longer, and after a while she would talk with me. But one time I saw Cricket and she was coming out of service and she was crying. I mean, almost like weeping. So pastorally, what I learned is if somebody is weeping on their way out of service, you generally ask the question, are you okay? So here's Cricket, and she's like weeping, and I looked at her and I'm like, are you okay? She looks at me and she says, I never heard that before. I never knew that God loved me like that. She said, because for 50 years, people told me God hated me. For 50 years, people told her that God didn't want anything to do with someone like her, and she was going to go to hell. And she said, if God doesn't want anything to do with someone like me, what would I want to do with God? And so she quit going to church for 50 years. And then one day, one of her friends came up to her and they said, Cricket, you have got to come to church with us. And she said, that's just not for me. They go, Cricket, the church is in a movie theater. She goes, all right, I'll try it. So she came out, this person that thought she couldn't be redeemed. And all of a sudden, she started hearing stories like this. She started to meet Jesus. And she found out that the rest of the world could look at you and say you're unredeemable. But that doesn't matter, because at the very same time, Jesus is looking at you, saying, I came to redeem the unredeemable. And if you want my love, if you want my forgiveness, it's right there for you. Even if all you do is reach out and just grab the hem on my garment, I will give it to you. Because my love is here for you. What I love about this story in Luke is that he makes it very clear that there is no one who is beyond redemption. And so today what I want to do is I want to end our time a little bit differently. I want us to have an opportunity to just pray to God, to lift up to God all the things in our life that we feel like are unredeemable, all the things in our life that we carry, the burdens that we think are separating us from God. I want us to do what that woman did, to stand there in the crowd and to just reach out and grab a hold of Jesus, trusting that if all we can do is just grab a little hem of the garment, we'll have all the healing and the forgiveness we need to experience His redemption. So what I want to do is, as you're sitting in your seat, I want to pray this prayer with you. And the words of the prayer will be on the screen, and if you want to pray along with us, you can. There'll be words of a confession, but if all you want to do is just sit and meditate on all the things that you feel like have been separating you from God, all the sins that are weighing you down, or just all the burdens that you carried in with you to this place, then you can do that. And then what I want to do for you is what Jesus did for that woman. I want us to stop. I want to look you in the eyes, and I want you to know what Jesus has done for you and the forgiveness He's given you. Because if Jesus said it was important enough to stop on that road, to tell that woman, then it's important enough for us to hear it too. So let's pray together the words of this prayer. Most merciful God, we confess that we are by nature sinful and unclean. We have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. We have not loved you with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. We justly deserve your present and eternal punishment. For the sake of your Son, Jesus Christ, have mercy on us. Forgive us, renew us, and lead us, so that we may delight in your will and walk in your ways, to the glory of your holy name. Amen. Now, just like Jesus stopping the entire crowd and saying, "Who touched me? Where is that person?" Jesus looking into the eyes of a woman desperate for His mercy. He simply said to her, "Woman, you are healed. Go in peace." And so I say to you those same words that Jesus says to each and every one of us. As a called and ordained servant of the Word, I announce to you, you are healed. Your sins are forgiven. Anything that separates you from God has been taken off you through the love and the forgiveness of Jesus. Go in peace. Amen. All right, well, you guys can have a seat real quick. We've got 2 questions, comments. All right, comment number 1, which I thought was really interesting, and it leads into the second question. It says this: in other religions such as Islam, you aren't allowed to eat certain meat because it's a sacred animal. I'm going to have to ask my barber about that. He's definitely Islamic and a really cool guy. But I think it's really neat because there are a lot of different religions that the sacred animal you don't eat. But it leads into the second question, which is about communion, which got me thinking. It's really interesting in Christianity that our most sacred thing, Jesus, He says, reach out, take my body, which is the bread, take my blood, which is the wine, for the forgiveness of your sins. God actually tells you to reach out and grab the most sacred things so they can build you up in your faith, which I think is cool. Which brings us to this question. It's why do we sometimes kneel at the altar and other times we do communion before the stairs? That's a great question. Sometimes purely logistics. I have less people, and with less people, we do it at the stairs. Sometimes, though, it's fun to be able to come up and to kneel before the altar and to just, be in reverence to God. But the amazing thing to me about communion is this. We oftentimes make it about the logistics of getting up there. Did we walk all the way up to the altar? Did we walk all the way to the stairs? There's pros and cons to both. One of the really cool things about just walking up to the stairs is, as a pastor, you get to meet and greet each person individually, which is a really cool experience. When you're at the rail, it's a lot of this number right here. But sorry if I ruined anyone's communion experience. But at the rail, too, it's just an amazing thing to be able to walk up and to kneel before God. with a person to your right and to your left, and to know it's something you do in communion. So, community. So there's neat parts to each of it, but what we should never lose sight of in the logistics of how we got up there is what God is doing up there. That communion is not about whether it's at the bottom of the stairs or at the rail, but communion is about the bread and the wine that Jesus gave his life to infuse his Spirit into, so that you could experience the forgiveness of sins. See, that's what communion's about. So it doesn't matter whether it's at the bottom of the stairs, or it's at the rail, or it's in the back there during the service walkthrough, or it's in a movie theater. Wherever it is you do it, God shows up when his word is present and the bread and the wine are there. That's the powerful thing about communion.